and welcome to another episode of Into the Afroverse. Into the Afroverse is where we're taking Black folks into the future. And I'm your host, William Jones. Today, we're joined by Clarence Haynes. And for those of you that don't know, Clarence Haynes has worked as an editor for a variety of publishers that include Penguin Random House and Amazon Publishing, as well as Legacy Lit and Imprint of Hachette Book Group. He has edited top-selling fiction titles like The 100th Queen, Scarlet Odyssey, Legacy of Lies, These Toxic Things, and Washington Post and Amazon Charts bestseller, The Divine Witch, along with its two sequels. He is also the author of the nonfiction work, The Legacy of Jim Crow, published as part of Penguin House's workshop True History series. So with that, we're welcoming in Mr. Clarence Haynes. How you doing today?
I am great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, William. Doing well.
Excellent, excellent. So in talking about all your previous works, what I really want to talk about today is your latest work called Nubia: The Awakening. But before we get into talking about that, can you talk to the audience a little bit about what got you into writing and what put you on this path?
Sure, absolutely. So I have worked for many years now as a book editor, and I primarily do what's called developmental editing, where I'm working with, on a freelance basis, I'm working one-on-one with different writers on their manuscripts, on their projects, getting their books, helping to get their books into shape before they're published. And, I've worked as listeners might be able to tell, I've worked in different genres, but my absolute favorite genre to work in is sci-fi fantasy. That's the grand tribe I consider myself to be part of. I've done work that not only features Black and brown characters prominently, but also European characters, Asian characters. Sci-fi fantasy from an international perspective is my thing, is my jam. And I got into that. I mean, really from childhood, I was a comic book person, and I've always been enthralled by fantastic stories, whether on the screen or in literature form. It's always captured my imagination, and always where I feel like I'm the most myself. Just because I think there's so much room to explore different types of ideas and realities in a really adventurous, often action-packed context, exciting context. So that's how I got into publishing. And then how I got into writing, it just sort of gradually happened. I would write here and there for different magazines or online sites. But increasingly, I knew that I wanted to start to write books of my own. And my literary hero, one of my literary heroes, my two primary literary heroes are Octavia Butler, like so many in sci-fi fantasy, and Toni Morrison. And Toni Morrison, she started off as a book editor as well before transitioning into writing. And so pretty much I like to think of myself as following in some ways in her path. So yeah, and so just as I've realized that that's where I want to take my career, opportunities eventually came my way, and it was through a publishing contact that I was hooked up with Omar Epps to work with him as co-writer for Nubia. So
excellent. And what is it in particular that attracted you? And we're going to talk about the book specifically, but what is it that attracted you to this idea of Afrofuturism?
The I think Afrofuturism might mean different things to different
Right.
people, but for me, it simply means that whatever imagination, whatever narratives we create that are somehow set in the future, based in the future, that Black people are there,
Mhm.
that we are centered in the narrative, and that we're doing things that speak to our history, and then that also speak to sort of new beginnings or modes of being in life that many people wouldn't think possible.
Right.
But really, on a fundamental level, it just means that we're there, and that's very important to me in terms of all aspects of my career. To have Black and Brown voices represented in a way that feels human, that represents
Mhm.
fully who we are. So
Yeah, and you know when you take on, you're writing about Nubia, the awakening. What kind of research, what kind of study went into building this world, telling this story? What did you have to, research and find out about the African continent as a whole, or Nubia in particular?
the concept of Nubia, that really, and what listeners, I want listeners to know is the concept of Nubia, the idea of the main uh, focus of the book. It deals with a group of young people who are the descendants of refugees off the coast of Africa in 2098 who live in New York. And these young people begin to awaken to a set of powers that they didn't realize that they would awaken to because their parents kept their birthright a secret. And so we gradually come to learn more and more about Nubia. We get bits in book one, and then in book two, which is will be coming this year, we get a lot more about Nubian lore and history. What listeners should know is that the concept focusing on Nubia, this idea of there being a place where African people lived in an exalted state, that all came from Omar in terms of the metaphor he wanted to create around Black people living in a state of grace, and sort of
Right.
how our experiences here have, through no fault of our own, been quite different. And so, in terms of research, that came from him in terms of some of the ideas around what the original island of Nubia would be like, what the lore would be like.
Mhm.
And then when I came in, I tried to do some research around contemporary Western and Southern African culture. So the everything from the names to the cultural tidbits we get from Nubian adults in New York represent those cultures. So that's really it. A lot of, I would say, actually, the more research went into book two because more is revealed about Nubia by then. What we also had to do was just research a lot around climate change, how the city might be affected by that sort of thing. That was part of our process too.
Got you. And what was, something that you discovered perhaps in your research? You talked about studying these different regions of Africa as well as Nubia itself. Was there anything that you discovered as you were writing this that kind of gave you like this wow moment or this aha moment, where it's perhaps something you weren't aware of or something you kind of thought maybe was a misconception? What is it that you discovered as you were doing this research?
There was nothing that I studied. I was a psychology and Black studies double concentration in
Mhm.
school and college. And so I'm in terms of my heritage, my heritage is very diasporic. I was
Okay.
born in New York. My family is from uh, Panama, Jamaica, and Barbados, and so
Mhm.
there's a mix. And then I have people who are from directly from Africa. So I had a certain awareness around certain things already. So I can't say there was anything that surprised me. It was just more about, and Omar and I talked a lot about this, more about just being aware of the differences in different regions, not just lumping Africa,
Right.
also, just making sort of blanket statements around what Africa is, and then sort of um, creating lore that's not based on anything but our fanciful imagination. So it was more around just trying to be careful and thoughtful, less around there being surprises. So even like the mention of the type of trees that appeared in Nubia are from a specific region. The fashion, and this is very subtle. This is spoken about just in a sentence or two. It's influenced by what we know of Ghanaian fashion. So trying to pull things together in a way that just felt like we were really honoring the culture that we were writing about.
Right. Thank you. And if you're just joining us, we're joined today by Mr. Clarence Haynes. He is a co-author of Nubia the Awakening, and we're speaking to him about his latest book. Now, how long has this book been out, and what has been like the response?
So it just came out in November, and the response we're getting, it's being quite well received.
Mhm.
I It's been a bit of a whirlwind. Omar, I didn't realize is like has got to be one of the hardest working people in show business. Like his filming schedule is no joke. And so when the
Right.
book dropped in November, we crunched like a ton of publicity and appearances in literally just a week, just to accommodate, just so he could clear out time, and so to make those appearances. And then since then, we've just sort of been continuing to let people know and interact with readers, interact with booksellers, spread the word. Find what I'm enjoying is finally now, enough people have read it that I can like start to discuss with them some of the ideas presented in the book. Some of the feedback we're getting, it's a suspenseful build,
Okay.
because people are sometimes like, wait, why? What? We spend a lot of time just allowing readers to get to know the characters, and so it starts off slow, but then once you get to the middle, it's like, wait, what? And then the connections start to all make sense.
Right.
So people are really clamoring for book two. A thing I'm proud of is that we're told that the characters feel uh, they're really four main characters, but they're a trio of Nubians who are awakened that we focus on, and that they don't feel like they're making like stupid decisions. Like sometimes in books for teens, like the characters will do things like, why would you do that?
Right.
And we
Right.
purposely, not Omar and myself, we're both New Yorkers from a certain time, and we don't play, and so we just really I was just really happy to hear people are like, yeah, the characters feel real and no joke, and like they're figuring things out. They're not perfect, but they're not stupid, and that was
Right.
really important to me. So,
And how can folks, I mean, obviously you're a bookstore, I'm sure it's on Amazon as well, but how can folks find you? What other places can they find the book? And where
so
can they find it?
the book is sold everywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It depends. Independent bookstores. Pretty much you can ask for it wherever books are sold. There's a couple of booksellers who have it online who have been really wonderful partners. There's Sister Sci-Fi
Mhm.
on Instagram. The owner of the platform, Isis, she's wonderful. People can find copies of the book there. I believe there would be signed copies. There's also, and so many, my neighborhood bookstore, Greenlight, in Brooklyn, in Fort Greene, Brooklyn, Analog uh, Bookshop, and I believe they're in Las Vegas,
Oh,
everywhere.
wow. Yes, it's everywhere.
Yeah, but
No, that's great.
it's just a matter of just asking for it. And my
Right.
Instagram platform is Clarence A. Haynes. There's a link to Nubia, the main page for Nubia, and if anyone just puts in Nubia, the Awakening, Omar Epps, you'll find it. So.
Excellent. Well, congratulations to you with the widespread success and distribution of the book.
Thank you.
Speaking of distribution of books, as you well know, there's this talk, this push to suppress Black literature, Black writings across, well, Florida in particular, but as you can imagine, that trend may carry into other parts. What are your thoughts on that? And has your book been affected by this in any way, shape, or form?
My thoughts are it's completely ludicrous. William, I can't even sit with this
Mm-hmm.
because I'm like, Toni Morrison once said the purpose of racism is to distract us from what we're supposed to do. And so
Right.
my job, I'm just like, okay, so I need to just make sure I'm keeping on with books that center our stories, that put us
Mm-hmm.
in the spotlight. I know there will be pushback. There'll be people who politicians and those who sort of follow their lead who will look to uh, ban books. My previous book, Legacy of Jim Crow, is particularly susceptible to that. I
Right.
don't know if it's been officially banned, but because it deals with the legacy of Jim Crow laws in the United States, it's exactly the type of book that would be considered inappropriate,
Right.
according to these fools. But I just feel strongly like being aware, supporting where I can those who are fighting the bans because I think that work is important. But and also just but primarily I guess being mindful that my work is to make sure I can do everything I can to have our voices out there to align myself with entities, organizations, and people who see the importance of this work and just do my job. That's how I handle it. So
I see. And you mentioned your other work, The Legacy of Jim Crow. What do you see in terms of the legacy based on your book, your research, in terms of what's going on today, 2023, and here on into the Afroverse, we're talking Afrofuturism. So we're also looking forward. What do you see in terms of the legacy of Jim Crow, how it's impacting today and possibly tomorrow?
I think I always tell people that when it comes to Jim Crow laws, and I think for a while in the U.S. there's this idea that just once they were over and segregation was officially done with, and we had the civil rights movement, that was that, and people not understanding, like if aliens were to come to America and they'd be like, well, why are so many Black people living in neighborhoods that don't have supermarkets and don't have are less resourced, and why do they have a harder time having access to said particular resources or to certain types of employment? And it's embedded in the history of the country, and so it's so important to know what Jim Crow was and then to understand the ongoing impact so that people just don't think like, oh, okay, the way things are were just sort of it just sort of randomly happened, or that somehow Black people are at fault, or whatever narrative they would
Right.
have in their head. That's a huge thing. And then in the future, my hope is that once people become aware of what was, that they can create different futures, create different um, visions. I think particularly for white communities and taking responsibility for equity and equality and seeing the ways in which people of color continue to be blocked from having ready-made access that white communities have. And so
Right.
I think that is my thinking. And then, for Black and brown folk to be informed about what's come before, to be
Mm-hmm.
aware of some of the things that might be projected onto us, I think that's a huge thing. That you really it's really important to be like, no, that has nothing to do with me. That's not who
Right.
I am. That's part of a historical legacy that's racist and that's oppressive.
Right.
That has nothing. I want a different future. I know myself to be something more beautiful, more open, more wild and free, and more capable and elevated than that. And so that's my hope when it comes to um, looking at the past and things like Jim Crow and such. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So one more time, if you're just joining us, this is Into the Afroverse with your host, William Jones. And once again, we're joined with author Clarence Haynes, and we're talking about his works, Legacy of Jim Crow. We're also talking about his latest work, Nubia, The Awakening. So when you to go back to Nubia, The Awakening, where do you see this particular story fitting into this grand conversation about where Black people are and where we're going? How does this story fit into that, to that conversation?
Wow, that's a great question. I have not been asked that. But I think I I would say that a huge thread, so two big themes of Nubia, and one of them is particularly super important to Omar, I can tell you, is the idea of parental legacies, the idea of communities, we as people having to take responsibility for, if you're a parent, if you're a guardian, the lessons you impart to your children, how that impacts the decisions that they make, how that impacts how safe they feel. Each of the four characters there are four characters whose point of perspectives we get in the book, and each of them have different types of relationships to their parents, particularly their fathers. And that's a theme that's very important to Omar. So I would love for there to be an increased awareness of for adults around this idea of legacy and this idea
Right.
of how you behave, who you are, what you internalize, what you bring to your household, how that impacts your children. For adults who read the book, and for young people who read the book, as it is a YA book,
Mm-hmm.
for them to feel like they're being seen, like their ideas and modes of existence are being honored and heard. I think a lot of times young perspectives are dismissed, and so we wanted to put something out there that was like, nah, we see you, we hear you,
Right.
and really wanting that to be honored. Another big thing, I'm the child of, as I said before, I'm the child of immigrants. And so also when it comes to how Nubia fits, to your question, how Nubia fits into this conversation of where Black people are going and who we are, being okay with change. A big thing, a conflict that arises is that the newer generation of Nubians, they have some knowledge of their heritage, bits and pieces, and they'll increasingly learn more. But they were brought up in New York, and that's just going to change who they are. They're just going to have a different perspective, and that's okay. And that
Right.
in fact can be part of uh, in the book, that can be positioned as part of the progress of the community. And I think that's something we have to be okay with as well, that what we can be informed by what came before, but also being very open to new visions, which I just think is always going to be the reality for new generations. So
Now that's pretty fascinating because I like the idea of talking about legacy and this idea of um, like living for your last name, so to speak, and
mm,
keeping that alive. And also like this idea of looking at being part of the diaspora as a source of strength. And yeah, you're someplace else, but if anything, that can be seen as an asset, if used properly. Because all too often, I'm sure you're aware, we get caught up in, well, where are Black people from, and somehow or another,
right.
if you're from one spot or another, you're kind of disconnected. And I like this idea of no, it's just that we're going to have a different experience, but we're still connected across all types of boundaries, despite where we may be. So I really like what you're accomplishing there. So that's a great response, and I think it's something that Black folks we need to get back to. I think it's something that we've had, but we kind of lost our way a little bit. So I'm glad that you're bringing that back to the forefront. That's great. The time is moving so quickly. We're having this great conversation. One more time, can you tell us, once again, I know it's all over the place in terms of bookstores and so forth, but online, how can folks find you? How can they find the book or more information about it?
Online, my Instagram, I am most connected nowadays to Instagram is Clarence A. Haynes, Haynes, all one word, no periods. People can find information about Nubia there, or just look up Nubia, The Awakening by Omar Epps, Clarence Haynes. You'll find it quite easily. And I highly encourage people to support their local booksellers. People can order it directly from an indie bookstore. But if your preference, if it's easier to purchase and sort of more mainstream outlets, that is wonderful too. So.
And I got to ask this because now it seems like Hollywood is coming for these Black properties, these Black creators. Has there been any conversation about moving this outside of the book world?
So that is as you can imagine, that is Mr. Epps's domain.
Right.
So he has that handled. My job has been to just make sure we get because I know the book business.
Right.
So I've just been like, Omar, you do what you gotta do. I'm gonna make sure we get the book
excellent
into ready. We particularly we got book 2 ready pretty quickly, and so I'm just leaving that to him.
Gotcha. So it's the power of partnerships, the best of both worlds, and
right.
I like what you guys created. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with today?
Final thoughts. I would just say I'm so honored. Thank you for having me. And please, I would encourage people to check out Nubia, The Awakening. I'm happy to answer any questions on social media. And but also just explore sci-fi fantasy. There's so many wonderful books out there, different authors doing different things. So I don't know, like you could put in like Black sci-fi fantasy, see what names come up, Afrofuturism, explore. It's a community I'm so honored to be part of. I don't even, there's like names I can start to throw out, but I actually just want folks to seek these authors out themselves and see who piques their interest, because there's some wonderful stuff out there.
That's awesome. So you heard them, folks. Go out and do the search, find your own path. And if you're not familiar with this world of Afrofuturism and this genre of Black creativity, I certainly urge all of you to become part of it. So that'll about do it for us. And thanks again, Clarence. I really appreciate you coming out and taking the time. And when book 2 drops, I want you to come back, talk about that a little bit and so forth. So we're looking forward to having you come back.
William, thank you for having me. This was a pleasure. Thank you.
I appreciate it. So that'll do it for Into the Afroverse with your host, William Jones. And Into the Afroverse, we're taking Black folks into the future. And remember, you can hear this episode if you've missed it or you want to tell someone else about it. You can find it on YouTube on the Afrofuturism Network page. So one more time for Into the Afroverse. Have a good day. Take care and shout out to Mr. Duke Productions for producing today's episode. Thank you.